Hello everyone, and a pleasant good afternoon to you all, and most welcome to our lecture H731. We are recording here out in the woods. We are smack out in the sticks, and we've been experiencing warm weather. So all the snow has disappeared from the ground, almost. And I assume there's going to be warm weather for another week here, but might as well, because it's a bit chilly indoors. So we will appreciate in the warmer weather. And I am completely fascinated as it comes now by Barbara Tversky. I received much more than I asked for, an enormous book. I had no idea it was that comprehensive and that it covered so many areas. And I've been thinking, how could I, in the most easy way, let you into the thinking without going around the whole business? Because this is maybe a bit unusual to think in the terms of Barbara Tversky. It's the result of research, and often, as we know, research leads us to newly unexpected paths, and this is definitely one of those. Definitely. I would say it would be impossible to think those things without the lesson from history. It's not something that you sit in the bathtub and you realize it could be like this. No, this is not something that will come like a creative flash to mentality. I call the lecture Space as Internal, or Space as Something Internal, but that is actually misleading. Yes, I already misled you. Already in the title you are already misled. When I say space as internal, I mean the source. I don't mean that it is internal only. I'm going to put up two here because I think history is the best way to show this. Before Newton, space was always internal, unless you were a cartographer or a geometrist, or you were working with a lens. And then only the little time you were working with those things. Nobody had any conception of a time or a space that would be external to themselves. And this is what Barbara Tversky called allocentric. To some extent we use allocentric terminology in language, but in this case is completely external to us, with no connection to us. This is what we call absolute space, or space with vantage point of a reference point of some sort, imagined reference point. An origo. So space was internal, and then it became external from those people. It was the same thing, internal, external. And it's easier even to understand with time. Time could be more complicated, but in this case it's actually much easier to understand time. And time as an objective source that is internal. That's how everybody experienced time until at least the 19th century. Somewhere there it changed. And the internal time was also the objective time. And that is very hard for modern people to understand, that it is the objective time, that it is that time that makes it possible to make dates, to make schedules. But you need to remember, in the East, for instance, it's only internal time, and that's what makes the train go on time, not a construction that would be external time. You need to think about this really hard. If there was supposed to exist an external time, you have to have knowledge of it. So that would be second hand anyway. First you see this external time, and then you say it, or you think it, or you feel it. So that would still be a problem if there was supposed to be an external time. So I'm not going to go into that maelstrom or cataclysm that is external time, where it starts and where it is. It takes a lot of thinking to understand there could not be any such a thing as external time, but you can understand that internal time we all have, and that is what makes us come on time, nothing else. But I will actually discuss something completely different, and now I'm getting into the subject. I will talk about mind, and that is starting with this book by Barbara Tversky called Mind in Motion. Normally we think of mind or consciousness and the self as something that is unknown and possibly not even knowable, something completely darkened out. We don't know what it does, and we just refer to it as it was some alien living in our head or in our body. And actually, just saying the word mind, even worse so as consciousness, it's a word that makes us zoom out our knowing capacity. And we say that is, as Putnam puts it, a black box or a bucket or something else. This is a very broad hand reference to something that we never thought about. And this unknowability that is mind or consciousness, this is the dark pit that Barbara Tversky went into as the only person so far, if you don't count Lakoff and Johnson. So you don't have to go with these words anymore, what is cognizing, because we just say cognizing. I had a cognition, I had an experience. She actually goes to say, what is cognizing? What is that doing? What is happening? What could there be? And this is actually, when you speak about something, you put something into the distance. You put space in between the thing you're talking about, the thing you're thinking about, and you make it more same. And this is similar to things perceived at a distance. Let's see, cows, houses, trees, they become same. They become a category. They become similar. They become indistinct. And by not being too distinct, they become, in a sense, quite definite. And this is spacing. This is distancing. And what we should do, because this is exactly what we usually do with our minds, and there's nothing wrong with that, because there's no right or wrong here. But the thing is, we could actually go and check out mind on a closer, a little bit more encompassing. And then we will begin to see the differences in the mind. And this is the way I'm taking today. Everything in that case becomes more specific, and you start seeing the workings of the mind. So let me put in an example here before it gets too tough and you develop the same headache I have now. Let me put in an example. This is from the book, page 53. The beloved physician and professor of global health at the Karolinska Institute in Sweden, Hans Rosling, was dismayed by the many misconceptions people had, even distinguished political and economic leaders of the world had about the state of the world. His TED talk, telling the dramatic story of world economic development in recent times, as if it were an ongoing tight soccer match that went viral. many of the misconceptions that people held about economic and social development came from categorical thinking. Categorical thinking is a bit like distancing, having a big distance. Especially dividing the world into rich and poor. Poor countries had no electricity, education, clean water or health care. Rich countries had all that and more. Nothing in between. Wrong, said Hans Rosling. Highly educated people vastly overestimated the percentage of the world that is poor, failing to update what was true in the world in the 60s to the world of the 21st century. They also saw poverty as all or none, not in gradations. Rosling found that two ways to help people think dimensionally rather than categorically. First, by dividing the world into 4 categories instead of 2. Labeling them levels to signify a fluid dimension, not 2 rigid bins. Next, he used vivid depictions. Population of the world depicted as icon of people, each representing 1 billion, 7 in total. Levels of wealth depicted in photos showing how people at each level get water, move about in the world, cook and what they eat. Life at level 1 does resemble our image of dire poverty. People earn $1 to $2 a day, carry water by foot in buckets from rivers, grow the crops they eat, gather firewood for cooking. But in 2017, only 1 billion of 7 billion people in the world lived at that level. Only 1 billion. Not the large numbers that most educated people estimated. 3 billion at level 2 earn $4 a day, get around by bicycle, have canister of fuel for cooking, grow more than they can eat and eat a varied diet. Importantly, the children attend school. That's 3 billion going to school. Even the girls. The 2 billion at level 3 earn $16 a day, have running water, electricity and a motorcycle. They might work multiple jobs, but the kids go to high school. As for level 4, we know it immediately. We're among the 1 billion at level 4. This is an introduction to what Barbara Tversky means by mind as space. For us to being able to perceive something new, to stepping out of the old, the only way is that the person who wants to make the change realize our thinking is space. And by using space, Hans Rosling made it obviously clear that the world of today, of the 21st century, is completely different from what we experienced in the 60s. People have been trying to do what Hans Rosling did for at least 2 decades by using just words. But these people haven't understand there is a sort of space already prevalent. That's already established. Words as such will only strengthen the space that's already established. It will not change anything. And Rosling was a genius at explaining this with pictures and using with his hands and also with his words, especially verbal expressions, to show that there was a new space going on. And now I think in so many people, thanks to Hans Rosling, this new space is established. The success was immediate and he got invited to Bill Gates. He paid visit to the Prime Minister in England, the President of the US everything happened in a very quick mood. He became extraordinarily famous in a very short time, for good reasons. And I don't know what would have happened if he didn't would have caught disease and succumbed in the process. But this gives a hint where I'm going. It is that at the base we are using space. And Tversky means that space is the only way of going about. But we are unaware about that because we say our thinking process is something we self cannot see. So the first step is to get closer to the mind, to the consciousness, or the thinking process, to make it nearer. And then you will realize what you thought was very homogeneous thinking, and I do the same thing whatever I do, as Hans Johansson, if I think about my economy, if I think about going to grow vegetable, planning a career, having a discussion over the internet in, let's say, Hong Kongese, Chinese, or whatever it is, or divulging 2 hours of playing chess. I think to my mind I'm using the same type of space. I do not. There are radical differences, but because we are so distant to the thinking process of ourselves, we don't know that. Because of the distance, everything looks same. But what we can do is, by understanding how space works, we will be able to put the focus much closer. And then interesting details will be going to show. We will understand that above and under, on the side, size comparison, relationships are incredibly important for what I do in all these different activities I do. And it's not the same when I do gardening as I play chess. Usually I just sit down and do it, or stand up if I'm gardening. But they are very different in thinking. And that is something that is so interesting. I haven't been able to put the book on the side. I think I spent most of the night reading it. It's enormously interesting because this is actually discovering a new continent entirely. It's like going to a new continent that's between India or Madagascar, and you discover this fantastic continent, and you can examine it yourself because everybody has this continent. It's extraordinarily interesting. She has 9 laws of cognition, and even though all of these 9 laws won't be understandable, I think that they will actually be able to draw a rather sketchy image of what she means. But I think it's going to be helpful. I have a very hard time thinking it will send you into the wrong direction. Anyway, first law of cognition. There are no benefits without costs. Thinking cost. It's a cost to thinking. Second law of cognition. Action molds perception. What we do is thinking. It's not like I do things in my daily life and then I think. No, it's the same thing. The action I do during the day, when I play chess, when I do gardening, when I brush my teeth, that is thinking. And there is no level difference. Third law of cognition is feeling come first. And I would say perception come first. And this is very similar to what Edward de Bono says when he means perception. But feeling, perception, they could be exchangeable. Actually, what you perceive space to be will come first. And that was the genius of Hans Rosling. He understood that no words will change, not only words, because there is already a space established, how the world worked. And you can make actually a sort of this is going to help, I think. So I can draw actually what space we already had by Hans Rosling, and it's a division in two parts, the rich world and the poor world. And if you start to explain, as people did in the 90s, early 21st century, that the equality has started to come because of progression in the developing countries. You will in your head listen to the words, and you might do divisions here in between, and that will be different colors, possibly, hopefully. But the original division, the space, is already established because you have a feeling or a perception of the world being in two parts. And what the people said only verbally will only sort of configure what you already have. This has also been proven neurologically. If you have one space established, you could do divisions here, and it's going to be a bit messy in the end. What will be persistent is this division. And that can only be replaced if you have another visual thing. And that needs to be both drawn and explained. So this is what Hans Rosling did. And I think he skipped the circle altogether, because that's already tainted. Because we're using a circle for ages. I even had a globe in school that was divided in rich countries and poor countries, and it was from the 70s. I'm a bit older, so I was still living in that reality, which was true by then. He used another system, and he used like graphs. And when you saw the graphs, you immediately understood it was completely different. Here you have something that is relative. It's not absolute poverty. This is the closest you get to absolute poverty, but it's no starvation going on. And when people heard this lecture by Hans Rosling, they became absolutely shocked. I did as well, because I thought there still was a lot of starvation going on in the world, and that people died of infectious diseases, communicable diseases, and there was a lot of war going on. But everything has diminished, and I think it's down here too when it comes to starvation. And here you understand bodily, perceptually, thinkingly. This is space acting. So you see, in the bottom of understanding and knowing, there is space. And as long as you remain in the same spacious model, of course, as long as you were into the mid-80s, when you still had this big division in the world, it was true. And then the words would have been helpful. But the world went on longer. Thanks to technology, thanks to progression, thanks to many things, everything changed. But our space did not change. That was the problems. And that was the brilliant idea of Hans Rosling. He had an intuitive understanding of space. If you want to change thinking, he understood, you need to show the thinking. So you could say that he went very close to what the thinking procedure is. He understood that in the thinking there is always space. And by using space, you can show different things. And I have previously shown that our present spacious model of reality is an object in empty space in front of a subject. And you can see both the verbal expressions and the picture can show you what's going on. This becomes impenetrable. You can't get into it. And there doesn't seem to be any insight to this as well. So all the properties are put here on the outside. That makes it unknown. It's a picture, it's a gestalt, it's an imagery that makes things unknown. And it's stemming from space. This is part of space, this is part of space. But it's a bit, this space shuts the knowledge off. You don't enter the part you say it's impenetrable. And this is very similar to when you hypnotize people. I've seen this live, and you tell people when they are under influence, when they are hypnotized, that there is an impenetrable wall in front of them. The hypnotizer are using space, visual language, and that can be very hard to detect. But by using specific words that gives the association of space, the hypnotizer can influence people. He cannot tell them, sit down, stand up, you're a donkey, you're a duck. No, that won't change anything. It won't make them influenceable. And even if they did, as he said, pretending to be a donkey, they wouldn't themselves believe it. But what the hypnotizer does is change space. Then he doesn't have to give them order. He already changed their reality. And what they did when I saw it was to construct an impenetrable wall in front of them. And they tried to walk into it, but they could not. They could not pass it. Everyone else could, but they couldn't. This is how strong this space is. This is real space. This has absolute effects. And speaking about that external space, like Newton constructed, as it was real, it's a bit ludicrous when you actually think about it. But it takes some time. You need to get into what Barbara Tversky means. But you realize afterhand, all space has their origin from the inside, from our thinking. We construct the space, and external space is originally coming from the objective, subjective space, inwardly. Everything starts there. It can't start anywhere else. It is a picture to believe space to be outside of yourself. Once you understand that, you have the key to open up your thinking. And exactly as in Hans Rosling's case, only a picture can do that. No talking in the world can do that. A picture, and that you actually act after it. You need to act like it was true. Then you will change your space. So you hear here how madly interesting this is. I have already been a lot fascinated by this hypnotizer, and I wondered what their scheme were. But they all had or have a very keen intuitive understanding how the mind actually works. Not in a distant way, but in the actual space. Something that is impossible to easily verbalize without a new picture, a new space in the bottom. That's especially those advanced hypnotizer and influencer. What's his name? He's not Corin Farrell. I think his name is Brian Farrell. He's British, and he made people jump out of tall buildings, shoot themselves. He made a whole group of people believe in ghosts. And he's the man who went to the horse races and managed to get money out. I don't remember his name now, I'm too tired, but I'm gonna add it in the link. That shows the force of space, and it is extraordinary. And this is actually what Julian Barber means, that space is something real. It will not be real if it's not coming from yourself. It will not be objective. And anything that is external never ever can be shared by someone else. That's why Newtonian space is completely emotional. Only something you yourself can have. It's a private language thing. It can never be shared. It can never do things communal like you do it together with people. That's what external space is. And Barbara Tversky, working in cohort with engineers as well, have understood that. I think ordinary people still has this picture of space as something external to themselves. But this is an emotional space. Yes, it's something that we believe in, but it will never work in reality. And it's actually the same with our thinking. When we realize thinking is space, we really get to the bottom of everything, to the foundation. So entering the mind doesn't mean entering some sort of mysterious consciousness, to enter into some reflection. It means entering the world, and it means to enter the personal world and the external world. There's no real difference. It's a difference in degree. But if you think about Barbara Tversky's mind as something being in here, then you're absolutely wrong. It's as well out there. And it doesn't make any sense to make a difference. You have a wonderful adventure in front of you, because once you start to understand where space is coming from, and that you can actually change this distancing. It's a bit like zooming in and zooming out. I think I mentioned that before. You have a sort of camera or binocular, and you can go in and you can go further. The thing is, with our present binocular, it's like they become rusty. They got fixed on a position where everything is very distant. Like you yourself is distant, so you can't see the details of your mind working. And then you can't understand the world either. So those two things fall away. But once you start understanding and trying, and this is what Barbara means by action or motion. Because when you're trying, when you actually do the movement, a particular movement which is actual, you can actually see the movement, and that's the changing of focal setting, the changing of zoom. And you can see that the mind works with all those tools that Barbara explained in her book, like under, above, in front, to the side, parallel, in a row, linear, non-linear, spherical, all those things, height, length, depth, breadth, you mention it, it's enormous, the whole system. She goes into the specific details. I won't do that here, but you will gain two things by doing so. You will see more that your zoom can change. You will gain access to changing the zoom. And you will notice after a while that you can be flexible in the distancing. You don't have to keep at a large distance all the time. You can get into the chase of the whole stuff. You can get into the core. And you can still keep the distancing when you need it, but you will all of a sudden be able to decide yourself. And this flexibility, that's a completely new skill that cannot be learned without you going into Barbara's book. That's impossible, because that's the uniqueness of her discovery, that actually we have an historical setting that ended up in the focal setting we have. Once you understand that, you will immediately understand you can change it. It won't be possible to change until you understand it. But it's enough with understanding. Nothing more is taken. You need just to realize and try it out. Then you will be able to do this rather marvelous new skill. Now to the second step, or the second thing. We make knowing enter into the unknown box of the mind. We get into that. And this is literally, I don't mean this as a metaphor, it's literally putting light into a darkened room. Our minds are completely dark because we tell ourselves that they are. We are like hypnotized by a hypnotizer who says that the mind is a darkened room. And what suggests that is the actual word mind or consciousness. That affects your head directly and shuts out the idea from you to read your own mind. We will make the doings and the workings of the inner part accessible to knowledge. You can learn about the workings. And here Barbara's book is an excellent tool because it gets you started. You see, well, I use all these tools when I play chess, and I use different when I do gardening. And that is actually space. And that space is never separable entirely into external, internal. And all of a sudden you understand that it's my knowing capacity that says that something is external or says that something is internal. And that's a setting you can change. It's a little bit like you have a machine, you can use it, let's say that the machine cuts the grass. But it's a very advanced machine, it's very big, it's made from Martians or something like that. So you presume, this is weird, it weighs like 50 kilos, but I can cut grass with it. But this is getting into the machine. And once you're into the machine, you realize those are pretty smart, those Martians. I can change the machine, and all of a sudden it can't only cut grass, it can also serve like a flying object. I can fly around it, like a UFO. And then I discovered I can use it to cut trees, and then I discovered I can go underwater with it. This is understanding the working of the mind. It's an absolutely fantastic exploration into things that gets even more stronger the more you understand. You can actually sort of guide these things. You can control them. You can investigate them. And no longer it's going to be this almost automatic process that you gather things from the outside, you put it into the black box so you don't know where it disappears. And you have this ridiculous 20th century idea of memory, that you take out something from this box. It's stored in there. And this is the past and this is the future, something like that. That ridiculous model disappears. And that model actually is very unhelpful. But you need to understand how it works, and then you can open it up, you can make it transparent. And you all of a sudden you will notice you can see into the box because your mind made it transparent. And in the end, by knowing it's working, we can actually change it after our own desires, what we wish to do with it. So all of a sudden, instead of the mind being something external or something at a distance that I hope I can sort of control but I don't know. I don't know what my mind is going to do with me tomorrow. Maybe the mind is going to go somewhere else and take a flight to Bahamas. I don't know. I don't have any control of it. All of a sudden, you will have a control of your mind. You will see that you can get into it. You can see how what you thought were coming from the external, in pigments, stimuli, or whatever you called it before, something that you were forced to believe in, is actually coming from space itself. And a very big part of that space you can control if you only learn the rules for it. If you don't know the rules, it's a little bit like the space machine I mentioned. You don't know the inside. You actually need to know what's happening inside the mind. And this is completely new for Western thinkers. I often compare to Indian language like Pali, and especially Pali is extraordinary. It has like a couple of hundred words for different components of this space, and verbs as well, at least 200, something in that vicinity. And people use it all the time, instead of having this rigid distinction between external and internal that makes everything more or less like a fantasy. There will be an extra bonus. Westerners are famous for being tensed, and remember this rusty mechanism of the binoculars that makes it impossible for us to not change focus. That rusty mechanism needs to be upheld, and that upholdment we do with our own bodies. It's actually caused by tension. That's the only way. We believe that there is a sort of friction in the world that makes it impossible for us to reach other deeps or widths, and that we uphold unconsciously by tensing our bodies. There is a very clear similarity between how we are tensed. And Barbara Tversky noticed that the 20-25% of people who trying to learn a task of some sort didn't use visual thinking, didn't use their hands. They were actually incredibly tensed. They shut off their perceiving capabilities. And that is actually part of a tension that started already, I imagine, by the Greeks when they were sitting in this illusional theater. Because you need to tense yourself. You will do it automatically if you have an idea of the world being outside your influence. That is tension. Because you'll have to stop your whole body from moving. You need to sit down in the theater and just observe it. Watch children. If you want a child to calm down, you need to stop it forcefully with your hands. And then all of a sudden it will calm down. We do the same thing with ourselves. We use muscular force to shut us down. That's why Westerners are so tensed. And that's why all these tensional things is rather a uniquely Western thing. Stress and tension are something that goes hand in hand with this rigid perception of what space is. It needs to be upheld. You can't really perceive it because it's too fantastic that the outside should be out there somewhere. But if you tense yourself and don't change your focal setting a little bit, don't look to the right, just look fast ahead, and you be like a horse with his papers or stoppers on the side. You only see forward. And this is the Western mind in a nutshell, from the body perspective. We are the only ones who don't take in the backside or the upside, because our very diminished sense of space, that will actually be opened up. Barbara Tversky shows you how you open up your body at the same time. You goes hand in hand how you open up space in mind. Once you start to understand mind, you will also have a laxness in the body where you once were tense. You will also gain tension where you need the tension, because there you find laxity among Westerners. And then you understand this is something that we talked about earlier, and earlier this was more or less like knowledge is embodied, something that Heidegger started with and Merleau-Ponty continued with. But here I more understand exactly how it works and how I can do it myself. We instead just listening to Merleau-Ponty saying everything is embodied. And I'd say the difference is like the prophets that came before Rusling. I think one of those most famous names are Mark Anderson or John Smith. They were a little bit like Merleau-Ponty. They just said everything was different. But what Hans Rosling did, he did it. It was an action, because an action is necessary. He was active. And you can see it when he makes his lecture. He is a bomb of energy. He's one of the best lectures Sweden ever had, I'd say. And it's incredibly encouraging. And you can see how his renewed and more open space help people in a very, very fast rate to understand we're living in a new world. And if it weren't for Hans Rosling, we'd still be living in the 60s when it comes to those things. And that would stop progression. But in the end, it was a different take on spaciousness. Probably came from his practical job. He's a doctor, medical doctor, physician. So that is my second introduction to Barbara Tversky. And if I do a third one, if this is appreciated, I will go actually into the details, which is a bit tougher, but I hope this served as a more comprehensive introduction and maybe made you a little bit interesting in something you never heard about before, at least. I hope it's interesting as well. And I say good afternoon and thank you very much. Bye bye.
Thank you.